etc. And if you're going to say anything that's sensitive, please do so. Do disclaimers before you start the round. And I highly encourage for you to raise and take POS as well for the engagement and observe equity policies at the end of the day. Okay, without further ado, debating in the motion, this House regrets the dominance of RuPaul's Drag Race and drag discourse. Calling on Prime Minister to start this debate here.
Oh, that might be loud. Um, God. Okay. I'm a bit tall. Sorry. Put it down. I can't be seen sa camera. Okay, I'll just get my recorder. Where is my phone? I'll just get this. You have to turn off your notifs pala. Sorry. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. We agree with opposition that RuPaul's Drag Race specifically has platformed the drag race community in general, and that is a good thing. What we don't agree with is the dominance that this drag race has, and that is why we are very proud to propose. There are few pieces of characterization or setup that I'd like to posit. Firstly, just on RuPaul's Drag Race. We agree that there's a lot of narratives that come from RuPaul that happens and manifests itself in Twitter or in all sorts of pop culture discourse. But also secondly, on what drag discourse actually has to look like. Because this is the question of this entire debate on what it should look like, which is two things. One, it should be representative, inclusive, and encompassing of all members within the community. So whether it be your a trans person who partakes in drag or a gay person who partakes in drag, your narrative should be supported. But also secondly, speaking of support, it should be appreciative and supportive, which is why the drag community is such a strong community, right? Because people love and support each other because of their shared identity and their shared struggle. We agree that this platform happened because of RuPaul, but what we don't agree with is the constant dominance that it has and the domino effect that it has with the quality of discourse in the status quo, right? First argument that I'd like to posit in this debate is that the dominance creates a quite exclusionary kind of metric that happens within drag discourse. What do we mean by this? There are 4 layers under this, which is firstly, it just includes performative viewers, or those viewers who don't necessarily support the drag movement or the trans movement, but are partaking or are benefiting from the exploitation or the blood, sweat, and tears of these drag queens or these drag kings who partake in RuPaul's Drag Race. Now, even if it is elevated, we tell you that they're able to manufacture these storylines, and it affects the quality of discourse, which I'll tell you why later is harmful. But also, secondly, it creates a standardization of drag, right, in drag art, because for the longest time, we didn't include drag kings in RuPaul's Drag Race, right? It was mostly just the drag queens, right? This also affects the discourse. So in comparison, with comparisons towards one another, that this drag queen is stronger than this drag queen, or this drag queen has better kinds of art with this drag queen because it is much more in tone with the feminine side of the movement, right? That is the harm of standardization. So we see this in the example of RuPaul not wanting the drag queens to have kitten heels. They want them to always have the really long the heels, right? Next thing is just the constant competition, or the way that RuPaul's Drag Race operates. While this competition is their platform, we tell you that it is harmful that instead of appreciating the art, they're constantly pitting the drag queens against each other. And while this thing is quite entertaining to see on the screen, the way it manifests in the discourse in the Twitter space, for example, is quite harmful because it makes it so that there are communities that are quite pit against each other, communities with shared struggles, communities with shared values, right? Next thing is just on how drag manifests itself in politics, right? Because it's sensationalized in the dominance, right? Because some kinds of in some forms of drag, it is in some forms of drag, there's some kind of political movement, but it is quite in a comedic light, or it is manufactured, right? The narratives that people consume are manufactured, and this is harmful because these are the purpose of drag discourse is to have and share the lived realities of people through this art that they through this art that they perform with, right? POI before I get to my next part.
Oh, actually, before
CO. Sorry.
CO, first, RuPaul said no sneakers on the runway, but second, your discourse is only limited to social media. Step out. What about the drag communities outside of it?
So I think the community and the discourse are quite the same. So even if like obviously if you tweet something, you probably believe in it. So the discourse in Twitter extends to reality, and I'll tell you why that's harmful later on. The implications of the problems I just mentioned are: one, this is the lesser quality of discourse, in which instead of forwarding your rights as a community or forwarding what you need to have in as a community, there's a there's a cognitive dissonance with what like the actual the purpose of drag is, or what you need to do as a drag queen. But also secondly, the dominance makes it so that there's a kind of standardization, because yes, RuPaul's Drag Race is uplifted, but what about the kinds of drag that are not very palatable, or that are not very like standardized in which the way RuPaul is? Like for example, with like the niche like gothic kinds of drag race, or drag brunch wherein politics is talked about. Those are the things that we don't have many ideas about, or those are the things that we don't really see on the limelight, because we only think, when we think of drag, we see competition, we see the feminine side, we see drag queens, right? Why is this true? Because one, the media incentives of how media operates. Because obviously, like even if like there's a lot of like many kinds of drag, the standardization is palatable, and this being palatable is harmful to the movement, insofar as the movement prides itself in being unique, in being able to encompass all facets of its community. But on to the second argument then, on why equal spaces are much more preferable absent this dominance. Because we tell you that the alternatives absent this world of just the RuPaul's Drag Race is being able to platform, or having the platform for all sorts of drag in the very get-go in these discourses. Well, we're not telling you that RuPaul's Drag Race is quite harmful in terms of just it being alone. I think the main problem is that it has a dominance towards the narratives that are actually happening in the status quo. Now, the alternatives that we have, that we propose, are one, like giving equal spaces to things such as drag den, that the Philippine context, or Drag Race Canada, or Drag Race Panama, those things that are quite different in every single context, or Camp Waikiki, or performances that are really very, very political, that are things that probably people will opt into, which is much more representative. Because these things don't standardize drag into one thing. They make drag so that it is encompassing of what the drag discourse actually asks for, or what it moves, what it like really like represents, right? And why is this likely to be fulfilling? Because these discourses are representative of the lived realities. This is also a reason why it's going to be palatable, because it is a lived reality that people experience. Because obviously the people in Panama would opt into the Drag Race Panama because it is reflective of the context that they have. Or if like drag politics, a Palestinian drag race contestant, or like would be talking about politics, the people from Palestine, or the people who empathize with that kind of movement, is probably going to opt into that, and that's why it's palatable. This is in the essence, or in the fulfillment of what drag discourse should be, insofar as this is in relation to the LGBTQ movement's progress as a movement, to have a community consensus, or to have love for each other, because we recognize that there is a shared struggle, and that this dominance is harmful because it standardizes a way of looking at a movement that is quite nuanced in every single way we look at it. And that's why we fulfill the representation, and that's why we fulfill the community. Because on closing government, they can't take the credits, because I already proved all of the harms. But also secondly, on opposition, they have to defend the fierce platform, or the competition that happens, or that this standardization is quite harmful, which is why we are very proud to propose. Thank you.
Well, thanks for that fine speech, Prime Minister, calling on LO to start the clash on the opening half. Here.
people to parasocially hate and bully Silky Ganache when she was just a fat plus size queen that was also a POC in her particular season. All of these things are true insofar as they have an incentive to sensationalize moments, for example, like Valentina not lip syncing, which has allowed immense hate to accrue when all of these queens are just human beings. They have different types of formal ways to artistically express themselves, and the only real reason why they've accumulated this much amount of virality and fame is because the Drag Race producers and the Drag Race creators know that eventually it is all just about the money. It is all just about the ability to create a lot of these famous moments to get profit off of the queens and their hard work and effort, when realistically they're not being paid a lot. If even then, the ones that are in episode 1 are paid like by the episode. So it's not the drag queens themselves that get a lot of the benefit. It is the drag producers. They do not have the intent to make proper drag representation or proper drag discourse, when eventually all of these things and these outcomes do not trickle down to the people that need it the most. The second clarification is that the incredibly narrow version of what drag presents in Drag Race is not what inevitably the whole Drag Race community wants, the drag community wants in the first place. Because now, you see 15-year-old white girls think that they're experts on drag when they've just watched 2 seasons of the show. Like, obviously, these audiences are not always going to come in as allies, as they've already posited and conceded. Therefore, the amount of representation you do within Drag Race is what impresses them, and it's what makes them see Drag Race as it is to what drag actually represents, right? So a lot of the times, when Drag Race viewers or consumers see like other arts of like drag that aren't like conventional, like they're not look queens, they're not acting queens, or they're not particularly pageant queens, a lot of them raise their eyebrows and don't support other forms of drag just because they do not actively see this represented in Drag Race as well. So obviously, in terms of standardization, it is still true. A lot of the time, the influence you get is subconscious in the way that you perceive media. So if you, insofar as your only form of exposure to drag is Drag Race, then the type of drag discourse that you make are going to be trivialized and are things that are likely a very narrow scope of what the drag community actually is. Before that, sure, POI. Okay, sorry, if there's no POI.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry,
Okay.
go.
Historically, why would the alternative succeed?
Okay, yeah. So I'll go move on to that. But first, I want to disprove this idea that you get accessibility. I want to note, historically, accessibility is no longer a big thing for Drag Race because it has become so oversaturated. It is really hard to enter as a new viewer. One, there's tons of inside jokes that you just do not get. Therefore, you don't get any fulfillment from having those jokes be the entertainment that you watch. Second, there's just hundreds of important names. You don't know everyone from season 1 to season 2, but they will actively come back to the new seasons and you don't understand these references. But also, they've become an inaccessible format because, again, producers see it as a main way to get profit. So you have Wow Presents, which are the only platforms that you can see all of these shows. So you also just don't get all of the full episodes in terms of Netflix, for example, or other forms of YouTube, because they take these down in intellectual property. So obviously, it's really hard to access it now. The reason why we get this better absent, the dominance, is that, one, we are able to better prop up local drag scenes because they're better adjusted to the fact that they don't need to appease Drag Race fans in the bar performances that they do. Because notice that there is no more competition against Ru girls. Because in reality, yes, Drag Race has given you social value as a drag queen after you go on the show, which means that most of the bars, most of the gigs, most of the shows prioritize Ru girls as opposed to local drag queens because they see that they get more profit from audiences and Drag Race fans that would visit these bars. So there's a hierarchy. You get paid more as a Ru girl versus local drag queens, and you get better gigs and opportunities as a Ru girl than other drag queens. This is really bad if you don't want to pit a community against one another. You want local drag discourse to be things that are inclusive, representative, that are always going to accept different forms of drag expression. So even if overall you get better attention on their side, they get more concentrated and consolidated attention to only a select few. So we take the trade-off. Even if overall we get less attention, at the very least, that form of drag that we are able to represent and make sure that we do prop up is like things that are true to your artistry, true to your expression. For example, like Pura Luca Vega can just wear her beard even if that's technically not going to be accepted in a Drag Race girl type of fashion of drag. Lastly, we also think that Drag Race is going to no longer be trivialized under our side because it's not just about comedy. It's not just about the look queens or the pageant queens. We can be increasingly and unapologetically political, where white girls who are properly the target of conversations of oppression are not gonna feel awkward just because we talk about these political issues as a drag queen. We think that drag would have been accessible either way, with the trend of progressiveness and the increasing youth platforms that we allow on the internet to be safe spaces for artistic expression. What matters in this debate is that in the presence of the dominance, we do not allow other forms to exist, and therefore we must regret it in the first place.
Thanks for that speech, Deputy Prime Minister, and also close the opening exchange, calling on DLO. Here.
Hi, wait. Can you give me like a few minutes just to like set up here? Hold on.
Sure, take your time.
Wait, can side.
Okay, sorry about that. Hold on. Okay. I hope I'm audible and visible. Haleigh, she, her. Pronoun, she, her. POI is only at the 5th minute mark. I won't take you any sooner than that. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. Being accepted by the majority is something that is meaningless when your community does not feel that it is united enough, when your community doesn't feel like they are safe with each other. And the standards that we end up creating through this discourse are things that are ultimately, at the end of the day, determined by these communities in the first place. So we think that they ought to be the priority in this debate. First and foremost, a few responses and callouts before I proceed to my arguments. Firstly, OG's alternatives as to we can opt to absent RuPaul's Drag Race are just byproducts or branches of RuPaul's Drag Race. They never prove as well why unification is something that's going to be absent on our side of the bench once the dominance is still something that still exists. And don't believe DPM when they say that it's gonna be all about money, because if it was, then RuPaul would have just stopped when they got their first Emmy. But assuming that this still happens, it still generates jobs for the community. At the end of the day, you still get all of those benefits on opposition side. Let's set up a few things then. Firstly, what does the dominance in discourse actually look like? Because we think that insofar as opening half and even closing is able to discuss this, they're only really talking about the dominance of RuPaul in itself, like as a drag race, but not what that necessarily looks like within discourse. We think it looks like two things. That first, this is probably the primary reference for people in drag discourse, i.e. when you think about drag, you think about RuPaul, and that there's the notion that the ultimate end goal is to compete in RPDR. We'll talk about later why do we think that this is still necessarily a good thing, even if like all other houses will say, oh, that's like costly and expensive to drag queens. Next then, I want to clarify two things. That first, the debate should be about RPDR and what it looks like in discourse. How we're going to outweigh all of the other teams. But secondly, the discourse does not only dictate quality on the surface level as to what necessarily that looks like with regard to drag art and drag performances, but it also shapes communities and how they form and function. We think that the extent of discourse is the most important thing you ought to discuss in this debate, and that's specifically on where relationships and where communities can be formed. Anyway, we already outweigh top half on this, because when top half says that, oh, discourse only exists on Twitter, I tell you to go outside and touch grass. Maybe you're not talking to other people. Arguments then. Firstly, we think that the dominance ought to be celebrated for 3 reasons. The first is that it opened many doors for so many individuals. You were able to get an increase of access and exposure regarding the drag community. Drag is no longer just a niche in the gay community, but it's something that the gay community as a collective has to look forward to. Because, why? Because discourse penetrates intellectual discussions in the community, because there's an intellectual basis. You have more things to discuss. The dominance of RPDR within the discourse created something of a commonality that everyone had to discuss. The second argument is that it birthed recognition in these spaces in the first place. It birthed recognition for drag communities exclusively because of the dominance in the discourse. This looks like, for example, Barangay and Puksaan in the Philippines or gay ballrooms in Europe, where we are able to have institutionalized structures that validate the drag identity and art because of the dominance within the discourse. But the third argument, and this is the most important thing, and this is why uniquely we should already outweigh all other houses, that we created a unified and shared background that goes beyond just simply being beyond like simply just partaking in this niche, that at the end of the day you are a drag queen. Because realize that the world is already extremely subdivided. Within the gay community themselves, you already have multiple individuals from diverse backgrounds, diverse nationalities, sexualities, upbringings, even diverse opinions about what you have to do and what you want to talk about. What the dominance uniquely does is it knits the drag community together under 3 levels. The first is that, for example, when people create Telegram channels to converse with each other about RPDR, when they have watch parties in España because support a specific Spanish queen. Or for example, secondly, when diasporas are able to be represented in the main franchise, i.e. drag queens who come from conservative countries who are not accepted by their homes,
Here.
you're able to reconcile their unacceptance from home by accepting them in the franchise, by accepting them in Rupaul. And thirdly, even when queens are going to be pit against each other, even when competition is probably something that's going to be the focus of the discourse, even when it's extremely competitive, even when I will argue with kADYto because I think Marina Summers is better than Arizona B, at the end of the day, we recognize that everyone is the same. We are all drag queens. We are all children of Rupaul. But okay, I'll take a POI.
Yeah, so
Three.
these communities and institutions have always existed. What Drag Race did is divide more than unite at the point at which you make camps for certain queens and you prioritize Ru girls over the local drag queens that you could have allowed to perform in these bars.
No, because the Ru girls always share their resources. You have a misconception about what the drag community is. Everyone in the community always shares what they have together. And even if they are pit together as you say they are still being valued by each other in status quo. It's not just about the moderates who care. It's not just about the moderates. It's about the people in this community itself. This already directly responsible to closing government, and it already outweighs government and CO. Because as long as, like, okay, sure, you have public acceptance. Okay, sure, you have majoritarian acceptance. But that's not important when at the end of the day, the community doesn't think that this is important, when the community doesn't feel that there is something, that there's a shared background that they all have. It's not important anymore when the community themselves doesn't feel like they are connected. We think then the two things, that firstly, right, we are able to sufficiently prove that, or that the dominance in the discourse is what has enabled people to be able to be more together, and it has enabled the community to, at the end of the day, have something of a shared background, even when they all have different kinds of different kinds of opinions, different kinds of nationalities. I have different thoughts on who I think is the best drag queen. At the end of the day, I realize we are all drag queens. We are all children of Rupaul. The second thing, and just lastly, there's like a few like miscellaneous call outs, right? That I think that opening government specifically operates in the worst case world where where RuPaul is like, well, where these communities are likely going to be like opponents to each other, and where RuPaul is like extremely like exploitative. We already think that's untrue. You literally don't see that happening in these communities. As we said, Ru girls are going to help each other. But secondly, then what happens uniquely on our side is that now drag queens are able to have this recognition. They have a key path to success that is something that is like, that's something that they can like uniquely follow. They have a well thought out path to be able to sustain their drag career holistically, and that's more important. It's more important that you care about these individuals in the drag community rather than what the rest of the world thinks about them, because what the rest of the world thinks about them doesn't matter if they themselves feel unfulfilled. You do not get this kind of fulfillment on either, on both opening opposition nor on government side, because they never prove why necessarily the dominance of the discourse was prerequisite for you to be able to have this shared background that unified everyone, and to have this institutionalized structure that validated, one, your identity as a drag queen, and secondly, who you are like at the end of the day. So yeah, at the end of the day, kADYto is my mother, like how drag queens are children of Rupaul. Rupaul is our mother. You should pick CO.
Here, thank you for that speech. I'm all now to close. The case coming from government, calling on government to appear. and up with here.
Hello, assuming I'm audible and visible.
Yep.
Thank you. I'll just get my timer, start my speech. Okay. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, and Rupaul, Sasha, Silhouette, and its parallel to myself, Steven, and Kino is We're All Mothers Who Enriches Our Children. The dominance of Drag Race on discourse birthed these concepts of chosen families to uplift not only yourself but also your art form, but also to give back to your community, just as how Mama Ru told us to. Before anything else, proper responses then to both government benches because they share the same premise. On the limits of drag discourses on opening government and even closing government towards just media. Letter A, all the misconceptions from OG is already actively being corrected, such as even their solvencies are all prerequisites from RuPaul's Drag Race dominance. But letter B, even the standardization is able to be flipped on our side because local communities convene to have clean or artistic makeups depending upon preferences, or to have padding, or to not have at all. These are the discourse that actively improve drag as an art form, meaning in and of itself, it's not just about the public appearances that it has as opening opposition painted to be, but the internal structures of drag as an art form, but also the drag communities within that affects their relationship as queer individuals. But letter C, we also flip the communities because now drag queens find places they belong to because they have mothers and also become mothers too. Do not believe Loreen as well, painting media or RuPaul's Drag Race as merely profit-driven when they push idea of tipping your queens, but it also elevates on the idea of payment. Even Edsa Extra and Manza, who has never done Drag Race, but are paid well because of their talents. But I think similarly in debate, it is justified because people who achieve more get paid more even if they're as good as any other debater. But I think it's a disservice to the legacy of Jiggly Caliente, who raised 3 seasons of PH Rugirls to say that Rugirls are monopolizing all opportunities. One word for CG. CG needs to be more dynamic because their case applies on any media motion. That in itself makes them lose in this round. That being said, two things coming from me later. So why does our extension independently win the round? From Haleigh, we then say that this course not only dictates quality of the art form, this is directly clashing towards government, but it dictates community, and it's worth celebrating because not all might reach Vegas, but we have Cubao in the Philippines, Bangkok in Thailand, and London in the UK. But apart from that, we created proximity to the diaspora on Latin and Filipino queens in the main franchise to diversify representation because Tia, a comedy queen, or Sasha, a performer, and Crystal Versace, a look queen, can win the franchise regardless. So meaning to say, everyone has equal footing regardless as long as you show up. But I think in terms of weighing, in terms of drag as an art form, localization happens, but we also say that wherever it is done, drag has been a universally recognized art form because you bring it to people through school drag competitions, which some of us have joined in the past. It doesn't become a niche thing only for the gay community. Therefore, access is better because we have mechanism. The RuPaul's Drag Race also, RuPaul herself as well, becomes the mother of all drag competition. That's what government does not answer or know. But the extent of the dominance in discourse creates community. Shout out to all my children. Yes, POI Loreen.
So the fact that you concede that it's being corrected right now means that the damage has been done. Competitions arise because Drag Race monopolized what's right and wrong drag for decades. But also, drag families was not invented by Drag Race. You can get this from shows like Pose as well.
The fact that there's evolution means that it is self-correcting, meaning to say all of the harms that you push are things that can be solved. That being said, two things. RuPaul's Drag Race dominance on strengthening the drag community, but letter B, how the dominance on discourse normalized the things that were already denied to drag queens and queer communities alike. This is where we mechanize why the dominance is important to create smaller drag communities. I think that what these smaller drag communities created the demand and audience following that even even in their own bubble, they're happy. It's not just about targeting individuals or conservatives. Of course, conservatives or straight people would not watch drag race, but it is targeted to queer individuals, whether those who are out of the closet or in the closet. But I think OO took a high burden case on palatability to majority. But we say how it allowed the culture of drag towards excellence, and that as an art form is the best tieback. It is also untrue about the incentives of being of these things being monopolized by Ru girls, because these people have learned to share. Like Marina headlines shows alongside other girls who have never done it. So we have local roast as well that exemplifies local comedy. So that in itself is already an automatic benefit that allows for the real access that is not mechanized on opening opposition. This is the prerequisite towards the local communities being curated and strengthened so far. But lastly, in forms of drag as a career path, which was mentioned by Haleigh, you have careers highs and lows because there's something that is being determined in terms of your victory. You know where to go because guidance has been long denied to queer people. At least this is something that has been shown to them. But talking as a concept help trans people, but even wigs for those who are sick with alopecia, etc. But letter B, on the birthing of rights to be handed to community members, I think this is a lot easier because this is more internal. The image of matriarch from Rupaul is a culture that pushed so many drag queens to their own identities and embrace themselves. To letter A, not hate yourself even if you're gay, because these are things that are actively being shown on mainstream media, which was never shown to us in the first place. These are things that are validated by closing government as mere spectacle. But letter B, to come to terms with the idea that different backgrounds create conflicts, but it's their drag identity that unites them. I think that the misconception coming from closing government to say that, oh, it's because it's always dramatized, it's all about the tea and all. That is their shallow surface of understanding of drag queens and the things that exist within those relationships. But on spectacle, I think that at least it's in the own terms of standards that are dictated by queer people and not the heteronormative society. That why is it okay that in PBB straight people fight, but suddenly it's not okay when it's me and Steven fighting? Let me just correct. I think this answers the premise of OG and CG standardization, because the standards are directly dictated by queer people. Let me just weigh the drama again that exists. I think these are normal on any reality show or any road that exists. Queens are humans and not everyone will be likable, and that is okay. This is also how the gay people or queer people or drag queens are actively humanized, because behind these are confessionals that pushes their storylines of queens who are migrants, who are adopted children, or who are HIV positive. These are the drama queens that CG paints them to be. It's okay that they cry and compete because that's what happens in the first place. I think the dominance created an empire birthing queens that race queens. Just like any other family, they would have issue. This is the dominance of discourse. Never mind the public acceptance. It's about the queens in Iloilo or Baguio. We win this because Gov only discussed the RuPaul's Drag Race as a media. We extend this even more. Very proud to oppose.
Thanks for that fine speech, Upweb. Now that entirely answers the debate. Congratulations, everyone, on you now across the house. Please wait for us on the convening. Judges, let's go on the adjudicators room. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cross.
Thank you
Thank
for the
you,
round.
Cross.
Thank you, Cross.
Cross.